Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today, I want to talk to you guys about the concept of multi-generational trauma. How these issues that impact individuals or even whole communities can be passed on to our children via epigenetics or via interactions with them or interactions with the environment. Our approach to this is going to be holistic in nature. We're going to talk about different ways groups are impacted, different groups that are impacted. We're going to talk about this from a biological perspective as well as historical and psychological perspectives. There have been a lot of different studies on this over the years in a true intersectional manner. So we're going to take a few different approaches to this. And just as this is something we're approaching holistically, it's also something that impacts people holistically. It's not just about mental or emotional health and wellness. This intergenerational transmission of trauma also can impact people's health. So we're going to take a deep dive into this today. So first up, we're going to talk about an article from the journal Social Science and Medicine from 2019 by Kealohi, Sato-Konching, and Thayer. This article is called Biological Pathways for Historical Trauma to Affect Health, a conceptual model for focusing on epigenetic modifications. This article reviews some of the groundwork, as most articles do as they start out, and it talks about how different groups are impacted, but they also share a commonality, and that's that historically subjugated populations tend to have poorer health outcomes compared to the general population. And that is regardless of their particular histories, their unique environments, or even their lifestyles. So this theory of historical trauma argues that you can have a collective trauma experienced by an entire generation, and that can subsequently impact the health outcomes of future generations. And it's a solid framework for understanding adverse health outcomes seen among populations who have historically been subjugated. Today, some of the groups we're going to discuss include Holocaust survivors, as well as Native Americans and the African American community. This theory has been around for quite a while, but the biological pathways through which this historical trauma is transmitted and how that actually impacts health has not been entirely certain. So we're going to talk about several articles today that try to illuminate the potential paths, some via modeling, some via epigenetics, some from a stress approach as well. So in this first article we're discussing, they present two potential pathway models. And they suggest that personal exposure to trauma or stressors can induce epigenetic modifications that can result in poor health. Now remember, in our previous episodes, we have touched on epigenetics. The second pathway that they discuss also says that poor health can occur through intergenerational epigenetic modifications in response to the parents or the grandparents having experienced trauma or stress. And that together, these two pathways can give you insight into why people from historically subjugated groups have higher rates of adverse outcomes regarding their health. They also discuss how epigenetics are potentially reversible, and so that these inherited traumas don't necessarily have to continue perpetuating, and they don't necessarily have to be permanent for individuals. We can make improvements in environmental conditions for the people who are actively experiencing this type of intergenerational trauma. And we can also try to use different types of impacts, anthropological in nature, medical, sociological, social support as well, to help reduce this high prevalence of poor health amongst these communities. So first up, we're going to briefly review epigenetics. So in genetics, you have two main components. You have your genotype, which is the actual gene representation of what your organism is made of. So your actual genetic components, your genetic constitution of your body. On the other hand, we have phenotype. So phenotype is how that looks. How are these genes expressed? So we often refer to it as gene expression when we're talking about phenotype. And if you remember from some of our other conversations on anatomy and physiology, remember anatomy is form and physiology is function, or structure and function. And that's pretty much what we're talking about when it comes to genotype and phenotype. We have the structure, and then we have the function. We have the building blocks, and then we have how they look when they're physically expressed. So when we talk about epigenetics, we're really talking about changes in organisms that are caused by modifying how the gene is expressed, rather than actually changing the genetic code itself. The term epigenetics itself actually means on top of or in addition to. It's that Greek prefix epi. So we're saying that it's on top of genetics or in addition to genetics. And epigenetics are heritable phenotype changes. It just doesn't involve changing the DNA sequence as it is. You can really think of it as changes that turn genes on or off. But those modifications don't change the sequence. They're just changing how the blueprint is really being read. So epigenetics works by altering the physical structure of DNA. So there are several different ways that you can have an epigenetic change. And one of those is through DNA methylation. And that's just adding a chemical methyl group or kind of a little chemical cap to part of your DNA structure. And that cap can really stop certain genes from being expressed. Another way it can happen is via histone modification. Histones are these proteins that DNA really kind of coils around. And without histones, DNA would be too long and not able to become compact enough to fit inside cells. So if histones squeeze the DNA very tightly, then the DNA can't really be read by the cell. So if that is already off, and then there is a modification made that really relaxes the histones, then the DNA can be accessible in order to be read. So in the first example, that methylation is turning that gene off, and our second example with histone modification is turning a gene on. And many genes are subject to these changes, whether they be related to stress, and trauma symptoms or tumor suppression, we can really pass these down to our children. And in that way, a lot of these things that were environmental changes for us when we first experienced them are adjusting our DNA in a way, and it is being passed down afterwards to our kids. So your environment really does matter. Your experiences matter, not just for you, but also for your offspring and their offspring. We're going to go on another break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about how inherited trauma can shape your health. Stay tuned.
Are you looking to learn more about the latest trends from the fitness world? Are you confused by all of the different trends that are out there? The GSMC Fitness Podcast is the place for you. The GSMC Fitness Podcast is the place to come for people of all skill and interest levels. Join us as we explore the latest trends in the fitness world. Does that new exercise really work? Should I try yoga? Whatever your question, chances are good you'll find an answer on the GSMC Fitness Podcast.
Concept of intergenerational trauma and how it is holistic. We're also introducing the concept of epigenetics, so we have a framework to build upon. Now we're going to talk about how trauma that's inherited may shape your health, in fact. A 2018 study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that was performed by researchers from the National Bureau of Economic Research found that the sons of Union Army soldiers who endured some very terrible conditions as prisoners of war were more likely to die young than the sons of soldiers who were not prisoners. And that is also taking into account that these sons were born after the war. They didn't experience those horrors personally. So it supports this concept that the stresses of the war were getting passed down between generations. And these effects on the lifespan also were apparent in sons of men who were imprisoned in 1863 and 1864, when the conditions in the prisoners of war camps were especially bad. So at that time, the crowding was very extreme, and they say that each man had about a grave's worth of square footage to himself. So they were just able to lie straight down, and that's it. And then there were a lot of deaths from diarrhea and scurvy during this period. So the study authors also controlled for other factors that could have influenced these differences in the lifespans between soldiers who were prisoners of war and soldiers who weren't. So they checked for variables like socioeconomic status, quality of the parents' marriages, and they found that this effect on mortality seems to really be working through epigenetics. Those other variables had no impact upon the disparities between these groups. They think that these changes were inherited by later generations, and that in turn also set some diseases in motion. So they're not sure if it's just the stress of war or the malnutrition that was associated with the time in the prisoner of war camp, or whether it is both. But epigenetics researchers state that the stress on the human system can cause the epigenetic markers to be applied or not applied. And it's kind of like software that's running your cells. So your epigenome can affect many different cells. And some researchers think that the reason why states in the southern U.S. have worse health outcomes today is that they also had more severe food shortages during and after the Civil War. So he's attributing that to perhaps malnutrition and stress in addition to epigenetics. We've also had some expansive studies in epigenetics within animal models. So mice have been taught to fear the smell of cherries by pairing it with an electric shock. And they had children and grandchildren that were also anxious when exposed to that odor, even though the children and the grandchildren of these mice did not have that same experience. They did not subject them to the same pairing of electric shock with the smell of cherries, but they would become anxious whenever they smelled cherries. Studies in the Netherlands in the period of 1944 showed that people who were conceived during particularly brutal winter famines, so when adults were eating 400 to 800 calories per day, remember you need about 2,000 calories per day just to maintain your body weight on average, but these folks were eating like a fifth of the calories they needed, and they were more likely to have heart disease as adults compared to folks who were in the womb during better times when more food and nutrition were available. They also found that the children of men who endured the famine while in the womb were more likely to be obese. They also did a study in 2014 that showed that the sons, but not the daughters, of fathers who began smoking before the age of 11, which is around the age when testicle havers tend to start producing sperm, were fatter than those whose fathers started smoking later, after their sperm had already formed. They also think that stress from racism can cause similar epigenetic changes. So people who have experienced racial prejudice and discrimination have more of that end cap methylation type of epigenetic modification on the genes that are associated with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and asthma than people who have not experienced stress from racism. Further studies regarding food and nutrition have found that the grandsons of men who had bountiful harvests during childhood died younger than expected, but granddaughters of women who were in the womb during a famine also died younger than expected. So they're saying that too much food is just as bad as too little food, and essentially that ideally our ancestors should be stressed just enough, but not too much, as there are also people who are undernourished at age 9 and they had grandchildren with better mental health. Additionally, that Civil War paper we mentioned indicated that sons could be protected from their father's traumas from being prisoners of war if their mothers had good nutrition while they were pregnant. And that is consistent with epigenetic research. So it's not saying that wherever there's trauma, it's always going to be passed down. Epigenetics really does allow for the possibility of reversibility via maternal nutrition. Another study found that the dietary supplements that were given to a mother mouse were able to protect the baby mice from exposure to BPA. So food can also be medicine. They've also noticed that in several studies regarding epigenetics and inheritable trauma, that the shortened lifespan tended to be only true for the sons of the men who experience these things, and not the daughters. So one researcher believes that epigenetics are being transmitted through the Y chromosome only. However, we're not entirely sure how this works yet. A lot of these epigenetic studies in this manner are mostly done through process of elimination. So they consider all of these variables regarding nutritional status and socioeconomic status and things like that. And then they go through and look at it and say, okay, well, it wasn't their environment. It wasn't how much money that they had or their access to resources in this case. And we're really seeing this split along the lines of people who were prisoners of war and people who weren't. So Therefore, it must be being passed down genetically. However, a limitation of many of these studies is that they haven't necessarily looked at the genetic component. They haven't looked at the individual genes, and they haven't necessarily looked through more than a couple of generations. So they want them to look at third and fourth generations in order to really increase the strength of these studies and to fully determine if this is exactly what is happening. That said, it is very likely, and there is a lot of research to support it. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk some more about transgenerational inheritance of trauma through epigenetic mechanisms. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
How inherited trauma can shape your health through generations, and some studies that support this concept. Now we're going to talk about an article by Alia Bradley regarding transgenerational inheritance of trauma through epigenetic mechanisms. This was published about a month ago, actually, in 2020, and is part of a poster rather than a podium presentation or a written paper. So this is just a different way that scientists sometimes present their data. So you make a giant poster and you talk about everything that you would normally talk about in a paper or in a podium presentation, but just on a poster. And you stand there and present the data to people as they come by and explain your findings and ask questions if folks have any. This study really looks at the epigenetic mechanisms associated with PTSD. So Alia Bradley focuses on PTSD as it's a common mental illness as a result of trauma. There are alterations of gene expression and DNA methylation via epigenetic mechanisms that have been shown to be caused by PTSD. They have also found that these epigenetic changes in folks with PTSD can be passed on to their offspring. They've performed these studies with folks whose parents had PTSD in traumatized populations, and that ranged from the Holocaust survivors to survivors of the Tutsi genocide. And it showed epigenetic markers, specifically methylation of the NR3C1 gene, that was very similar in nature to the mother's. They have also used mice, as we discussed earlier, in many different studies to show depression, anxiety, inability to cope with stress, and social withdrawal up to 4 generations from the initial onset of this issue in the parent mice. So there is a lot that goes on with trauma inheritance. Since epigenetic expression can be affected via environmental mechanisms, sometimes the child may not have necessarily inherited the PTSD marker from their parents, but rather experienced something that was traumatic in their own lives and therefore developed it later on in life. So I think that what we would really need to possibly see going forward is the genotype, really, of children. Very small infants, have them genotyped very young, and then also check their genotype as they age in longitudinal studies to see if these issues were already present when they were born and before trauma could have occurred, and to see how that changes through their lifespan. Now, I am not an epigenetic researcher. I am an anthropologist who is interested in human variation and adaptation. So I am interested in this topic and have taken some courses in biology and genetics, but I am not an expert here. But that is one way that I think that we could approach this going forward. So we're going to talk a little bit about this first, and then we are going to talk about the importance of twin studies in this type of research. So in Alia Bradley's poster, she talks about the methylation of NR3C1, that gene in the children later on. So that study focused on women who survived the Holocaust and who survived the Tutsi genocide, and they saw that their methylated genes were inherited by their children. Normally, when the ovum and the sperm meet each other to make a child, they have already been created a long way back, and they also go through a scrubbing process where it kind of reprograms many of the genes. It almost gives them a reset to remove any of those epigenetic changes so that they're getting a clean, shiny new copy of those genes. But scientists now think that sometimes that doesn't entirely happen, and that some of these genes are getting through without being fully scrubbed, or some of these sperm and ova are getting through without their genes being scrubbed or reset. So with this DNA methylation, they found that higher rates of DNA methylation of specifically NRC31 were found in survivors and their children, and that specific gene is something that codes for glucocorticoid receptors on cells. So turning that gene off means that glucocorticoid reception is hindered. So then your body is not able to cope with stress. It doesn't have any of those receptors on the cells, those attachment sites, in order for your body to do what it needs to do. So in this way, trauma truly can impact your health. It can truly impact your gene expression. Remember, it's not changing your genes themselves, but rather changing their structure. And we know from anatomy that structure and function are intertwined. So by adding these little methyl caps, you are turning off your body's ability to cope with stress as a result of having experienced trauma. We tend to think of trauma as being a mental issue or an emotional issue, but it really, truly is holistic in nature, and it is also a very physical issue. Researchers who were looking at the NRC31 gene and methylation rates of it also compared the data of children whose mothers were exposed to trauma versus that of children whose mothers were not exposed to trauma. And they found that the methylation rates of that specific cytosine-guanine base pairing junction was higher in the children of exposed mothers when compared to the children of unexposed mothers. And that suggests that the methylation was indeed inherited from their mothers. We've additionally seen something similar in mouse models. So they have exposed more mice to trauma, and we're giving them stress tests to measure their stress responses and passive coping. And this was measured in the patrilineal way, so by the fatherhood, the paternal transmission of these genes. So when they did this, they were measuring the amount of time that these mice spent in the open arms of an elevated maze compared to control mice. And they found that in the first generation, which is F1, and in the second generation, F2, those mice were found to spend more time in that part of the test, and that seemed to confirm an inherited aversion to open space that they received from their fathers. The F3 generation had fewer instances of that phenotype. So they measured the time it took for mice to also enter a maze. And in the F1, 2, and 3 generations, the mice were found to spend a significantly decreased amount of time in deciding to go ahead and enter the maze. And that is in comparison to the control. So this suggests some risk-taking behaviors were present in these 3 generations of mice that were sired by father mice who had been exposed to trauma. So they went ahead and looked at how these mice were dealing with their stress responses and passive coping, and they compared it with the control mice. So when they did this, they found that all of them seemed to engage in risk-taking behavior that had been sired by the father mice who had been traumatized. They also found that F3 had depressive-like symptoms. F2 males only had dysregulated glucose and insulin levels. There was altered social recognition up to the F3 generation, and there were memory defects in up to F2. So they aren't entirely sure about the mechanics of this transmission of transgenerational phenotypes, but they believe that it's correlated to changes in DNA methylation in sperm, in addition to other epigenetic factors. So they feel that this is multifactorial and that there are other mechanisms that are working in tandem to impact these bodies in a very nature and nurture type way. One of the best ways that we are able to study these types of issues are in twin studies. So twin studies are widely used in psychology and also in genetics, and this is really no different. So you may remember a few years back, identical twin astronauts Mark and Scott Kelly were separated for a little bit. So Scott was on the International Space Station for a while Mark was still planet-side. And they had identical DNA before they left. And they still had identical DNA when they came back. But 7% of Scott's genes altered in how they were expressed while he was in space. And 7% of those genes did not return to their pre-flight states months after he came back. So people tended to interpret that as meaning that they were no longer identical. But if 7% of Scott's genetic code, like his actual DNA, had changed, then he would be an entirely different species. Instead, it's the epigenetics that changed. It's just the structure via methylation and histone modification and so on. So his genetic code did not change, but his gene expression changed as it was trying to adapt or react to life in space, because that environment is very different. So with epigenetics, these genes are just reacting to different things in the environment at your cellular level. And it's sometimes referred to as the symphony of life. So the genes are the instruments in the symphony of life, but they need someone to play them. So in that regard, epigenetics are the musicians that play the different genes as their instruments. Sometimes you have a very long note that's expressed. Sometimes you have those silent rest notes. So epigenetics will express or silence performance of genes. And it's not just trauma that can result in this. Exercise, sleep, aging, stress, disease, and diet have all been shown to have significant impact on the epigenome. And that's really where twin studies are most valuable for researchers, especially when it comes to twins who've been raised apart. So that is a lot harder to come by, identical twins who have been raised apart, but there has been research over the years that can really illustrate the impact of these epigenetic differences. However, sometimes it's not entirely clear, and some researchers believe that that may be related to changes even in the womb. So having a thin versus a thick placenta, or the size of the umbilical cord, they believe that these things could also factor in very early on. So they're really looking into it to see precisely what is resulting in these differences. But when it comes to studying the differences in epigenetics and issues of nature and nurture, identical twin studies are our best bet. We're going to go on another quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about epigenetic mechanisms as they relate to trauma and psychopathology, particularly as they are associated with chromatin. Stay tuned.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Transgenerational inheritance of trauma through epigenetic mechanisms, particularly as they relate to DNA methylation, PTSD, and some studies performed in mice. Now we're going to talk about epigenetic mechanisms, trauma, and psychopathology targeting chromatin remodeling complexes. This article was published online in 2019, and it is by Bielovsky et al. In the journal Reviews in the Neurosciences. In this article, they talk about this growing body of evidence regarding epigenetics and how it works in the process of developing psychopathologies. And they're really thinking that it might be due to chromatin remodeling. So first up, what is chromatin? So chromatin is the material that your chromosomes are made up of. That is protein, RNA, and DNA. So everything other than bacteria have chromosomes that are made of chromatin. So protein, RNA, DNA. Chromatin's job is to package DNA into a very small ball, more or less, a very small arrangement, so that it fits into the nucleus of the cell, and so that it can protect the DNA structure and the DNA sequences as they are. By packaging DNA into chromatin, it allows you to have your cells undergo mitosis and meiosis. And it also prevents your chromosomes from breaking and can control gene expression and the replication of more DNA. So chromatin is really important for you, even though it is incredibly microscopic. And since it controls some of your gene expression, it's important to take a look at that regarding epigenetics. And that's precisely what Bielowski et al. Were looking to do in this study. As we discussed earlier, there are several different epigenetic mechanisms. We went over DNA methylation and modification of histones, so how that works. And they can be modified via methylation, acetylation, or even phosphorylation. So that means adding a methyl, an acetyl, or a phosphor group onto the DNA to change its structure without actually changing the DNA sequence itself. So you can also regulate DNA expression by microRNA species and modifying the DNA expression via ATP-dependent protein complexes. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and it's an energy carrier molecule. So it's in the cells of all living things. ATP really captures chemical energy that you get from breaking down food molecules, and it releases it in your body to help fuel other cellular processes. Most studies regarding epigenetics in psychiatry really focused on DNA methylation and histone acetylation. But these researchers want to look into nucleosome remodeling via those adenosine triphosphate, those ATP-dependent complexes in developing psychopathologies. The reason they want to focus on that is those specific protein complexes are in control of the histone arrangement, and that means that they can also alter the chromatin structure. So if you have tightly packed heterochromatin, as we discussed before, then you can't translate it. Your body is not able to read it. So remember, if the histones have it bound up too tight, then you're not going to be able to have those sequences read, so it's effectively turned off. But if you're able to loosen it up, then you're going to enable it to be read because it's going to have an easier access to those genes. So a lot of ATP-dependent complexes use something called ATP hydrolysis to help adjust that dynamic process of accessibility. So it's really in control of whether this can be read or not read. So that's what these researchers are really looking at in this study. And they looked at 59 articles in the review. 31 of them were experimental in nature. So as we discussed in one of our most recent episodes, it's important to have these randomized clinical trials or these experimental studies in addition to merely observational studies. They found in these articles that epigenetic processes are really important in mediating how you are experiencing your environmental pressures and reacting to them, even on a genetic level. So stressful and traumatic events, those are environmental in nature, but they can also impact your phenotype. They can impact your physical health as well as your mental health. They can affect how you function psychosocially, as well as impacting your general environmental fitness. So they found a lot of alterations in the protein architecture, and that resulted in some short-term memory issues. So then these epigenetic processes contributed to a conversion of unstable short-term memory to long-term memory. So that means the new gene expression that they found is hypothesized to be important for creating long-lasting memory trails of a stressful event. In addition to methylation, acetylation, and phosphorylation of histones, there are also some studies on this ATP-dependent chromatin remodeling complexes that the authors wanted to take a look at. And the epigenetic mechanisms that are a result of this are associated in memory consolidation. And the two components of this that are really associated with memory consolidation are important in especially visually contextual fear memory, but it does not have anything to do with consolidating auditory fear, only that which you're able to see. This particular study really gives us a framework to understand the role of epigenetic mechanisms of specifically ATP-dependent chromatin remodeling complexes as they relate to different psychopathologies. And it shows that environmental pressure in various forms, like stress or trauma, may interact with genetic vulnerability via these epigenetic processes, and thereby play a critical role in the development of psychiatric disorders. Now, they're not saying that epigenetics is solely responsible for this, rather that you may have some type of genetic vulnerability or predisposition towards certain types of psychopathologies like depression, anxiety, PTSD, schizophrenia, and that interactions with your environment can trigger those genes to be expressed or to be suppressed. So the ATP-dependent chromatin remodeling complexes can really steer that process of DNA accessibility, whether those histones are too tight so that they can't be read, or whether they are loose enough to be read. It can control upregulation and downregulation of gene expression, and also impact the development of your brain. So there are 3 different families of proteins that they discussed, and they found that they are all representative of ATP-dependent chromatin remodeling complexes, and they're critical in the development of various psychopathologies, especially those that are often accompanied by cognitive impairments. So they looked at these, and they found that they're related to long-term memory and psychological trauma. And they think that these psychological issues that are associated with helplessness, forced submission, and low in hierarchy position led to epigenetic changes. Now, that could be applied to childhood trauma and childhood abuse or domestic violence, or also experiences of racism. They also found evidence of the role of chromatin remodeling complexes in the development of depressive-like behavior that is associated with the feeling of social defeat. And really, this means that these issues are multi-dependent upon each other. These environmental factors, in combination with genetic vulnerability, can really create a wide range of possible issues for the presentation of different psychopathologies. But the good news is that it can also create a vast range of therapeutic methods for the prevention and the management of these same psychopathologies. So the researchers ultimately hypothesized that from the research they were examining, that they can contribute to the development of swifter diagnostic procedures and novel treatment targets through further study of this ATP-dependent chromatin remodeling complex in relation to psychopathologies and epigenetics. Often understanding the how will help us also understand the why and the ways around it or through it. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about how generational trauma specifically affects historically subjugated groups such as Native Americans, Holocaust trauma survivors, and African Americans within the U.S. Stay tuned.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing the concept of epigenetics as it relates to chromatin remodeling complexes and how these interplay with environmental issues and genetic vulnerabilities to result in psychopathologies, as well as the prevention and treatment of these psychopathologies. Now we're going to talk about generational trauma. And first up, we're going to discuss how it affects Native Americans and their communities. The article that we're looking at is by Thoresen et al. And has been published this year in 2020 at the Iowa State Conference on Race and Ethnicity. So first up, let's define generational trauma. In this study, they have defined it as including transgenerational, intergenerational, historical, and cross-generational trauma. The researchers state, and I quote, "It is essential to understand both the facts of the traumatic events, how family members coped or didn't cope with the effects, and what lessons of life and survival were passed on, consciously and subconsciously," end quote. So we're going to take a look at that and what this means. So Native Americans were subjected to traumas that are defined in specific historical losses of population, culture, land, and their family members. These traumas in turn resulted in historical loss symptoms that are related to socio-environmental as well as psychological functioning, and they persist to this day. Regarding the loss of population, the native population decreased by 95% after Columbus came to America in 1492, mainly due to the intentional killing of Native Americans and also the exposure of European diseases. The most common one that we discuss tends to be smallpox, but also measles, diphtheria, and several other European diseases were at fault for this. In 1830, the Native Americans were guaranteed peace via a treaty in the Indian Removal Bill in exchange for native land that was east of the Mississippi River. The Choctaw, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole peoples signed those treaties, but they were not given the peace that was promised. They didn't have enough supplies or food, and they often were met with hostility, violence, and even death, which is what is referred to when we talk about the Trail of Tears. Native Americans were also robbed of their culture with the invention of the Code of Indian Offenses Law in 1883. So the government began promoting Christian education at that time, and they enacted this law. The law was meant to punish Indian dances or feasts or any other types of traditional practices by putting folks in jail for 30 days or withholding food for that period. And if a medicine man encouraged other people in his group to take part in these traditional practices, they would imprison him for 10 days for encouraging them or instigating unlawful practices, although they might also imprison him until he would prove that he had abandoned his beliefs. That code was not abolished until 1978, with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. That was only 42 years ago. I am 31. This was just before my lifetime, and my mother was just becoming a teenager at this point. It was not that long ago. The authors of this study also put forth a conceptual model of historical trauma and how mass trauma may be experienced by large groups of people and not just individuals. And they state that the dominant group subjugates a population and then segregate or displace individuals or entire groups. They may react to them with physical or psychological violence, destruction of their economy, and dispossession of their culture. Then you have the trauma response. So that response may be physical, social, or psychological. We discussed PTSD and depression as well as anxiety earlier, and those may in turn cause anger or aggression, social isolation, shame, feelings of devaluing the self, terror and fear, grief, withdrawal, or even numbness. Physical responses may be related to nutritional stress, the immune system becoming compromised, biochemical abnormalities, impairment of the endocrine system, adrenal maladaptation, gene impairment, and expression. And these can result in issues like diabetes. Remember when we talked about the endocrine system and when we did our episodes about diabetes, how these are involved with each other as they are also involved in nutritional stress. You also have infectious diseases. So if you are not healthy, you're more vulnerable to these infectious diseases. If you're malnourished, you are more vulnerable. If you have diabetes, then you are more vulnerable to infectious disease. And we can see that very clearly right now with COVID-19 and how it is disproportionately impacting people of color as well as people who are diabetic or have cardiovascular issues. They're already having these health issues, and so it's harder for their bodies to fight off infectious diseases. In addition to diabetes and infectious disease, these physical responses may also result in hyperglycemia, heart disease, high blood pressure, and cancer. For the social responses, you may also see an increased suicide rate, domestic violence, unemployment, substance use, maltreatment of children, poverty. And that can result in a breakdown of the community and family structure, as well as social networks, separation from loved ones, and a loss of resources. So that is in the first generation. That's the trauma response for people who are directly experiencing that. Then you have the secondary and subsequent generations. In the mouse models we discussed earlier, remember those were referred to as F1, F2, F3, F4, and so on down the line. So you have these modes of intergenerational transmission, and they may be physiological or genetic, as we discussed with the epigenetic component. They may also be environmental. So issues like poverty are still generational issues that can impact your family for generations, for decades, for centuries. You have psychosocial components, socioeconomic and political systems that may also perpetuate these issues and visit these same traumas upon multiple generations, even if the individuals did not inherit these epigenetics from their parents or their grandparents. You may also have legal and social discrimination, as we can see right now as is happening with the Black Lives Matter movement. It also results in statistics like the fact that depression and dementia are the most common mental disorders in Native Americans, and that the suicide rate for Native American women is up by 139%. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for Native youth who are between the ages of 15 and 24 years old. Additionally, American Indians and Alaskan Natives who are 65 years old and older are more likely to have a hospital stay and have certain health conditions. A hospital stay is defined as having been in the hospital for overnight or longer within the past 12 months. Most of the U.S. population, age 65 and up, just the general population, are at 15%. It is 33%, more than twice that for American Indian and Alaskan Natives age 65 and older. When compared to the general U.S. population age 65 and older, American Indian and Alaskan Natives age 65 and older are more likely to have diabetes, strokes, heart attacks, coronary heart disease, and depression by anywhere from between 4 to 8% more likely than the general U.S. population. They are also more likely to have socioeconomic impacts with their health or just access to health care in general. Many of them have had to wait very long for an appointment or in a waiting room or not had transportation to get to the doctor or not been able to see a doctor because of the cost or the office wasn't even open when they could get there. Now, that does happen to many people around the world. Socioeconomic status impacts everyone. But they did compare this to the U.S. population age 65 and older. And so that was 3% for needing to wait too long for an appointment, compared to 12% for the American Indian Alaskan Natives of that same age group. They are 4 times more likely than the average U.S. population of the same age group to have to wait very long for an appointment or to wait too long in a waiting room. They are 11 times more likely to not have transportation to the doctor. They are 5 times more likely to not be able to afford the doctor's appointment at all. And they're 3 times more likely to not be able to get to the office when it's open. They are also having a shortage of physicians and other health facilities available to them in their area. It's very similar to the concept which we discussed previously regarding food deserts. It is an access to healthcare desert. Additionally, only 0.2% of the students at Iowa State are American Indian or Alaskan Native in the undergraduate range. That is from 2015 to 2019. They looked each year, and each year it remained at 0.2%. So this study really illustrates that trauma can have far-reaching repercussions, far past just the initial group that was experiencing the trauma or the initial individual. It can affect all communities and people. It can be especially targeted towards those who have historically been subjugated, and it can spread genetically, environmentally, and culturally. It can impact mental health and have a cascade effect. We're going to go on another break, and when we come back, we're going to specifically talk about how this applies to the African American community. Stay tuned.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about generational trauma as it impacts Native Americans and their communities. Now we're going to talk about post-traumatic slave syndrome. This is a literature review on African American community healing and expressive arts therapy that was published in 2019 by Ekenlana Burrows. So, post-traumatic slave syndrome, or PTSS, is defined as, quote, a condition that exists when a population has experienced multi-generational trauma resulting from centuries of slavery and continues to experience oppression and institutionalized racism today. In this literature review, the author examines the physical, mental, and socio-emotional impacts of institutionalized oppression from the 1600s to the modern day setting, and they are discussing how it specifically relates to the African American community through the framework of PTSS. In the early 1600s, 100,000 enslaved Africans were brought to the United States, and within 3 decades, that number grew to more than 30 million. In addition to being slaves, which is oppressive and traumatic in and of itself, they were also subjected to realities such as beatings, rape, lynching, the dissolution of their families, food and water deprivation, and other forms of inhumane treatment. In addition to those realities, they were also living constantly stressed and in fear for their lives because of this trauma, and also in fear of the lives of their friends and family, including their children. In 1662, Virginia law stated that children born of an enslaved mother would also be enslaved for life, and so would their subsequent children. In 1808, the import of enslaved Africans was prohibited by Congress, but was not strictly enforced. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln delivered the Emancipation Proclamation to end the Civil War and slavery in Confederate territory. But it was not until 2 years later, on June 19, 1865, that the last 250,000 slaves in Galveston, Texas were even told that the Civil War had ended and that all of them were free. If you aren't familiar with Juneteenth, and you are starting to see Juneteenth be mentioned a lot online recently, that is why. So we celebrate as a nation July 4th, 1776 as Independence Day, because that's celebrating the independence of the American people from the British and the establishment of this nation by white colonists. We celebrate Independence Day as being about freedom from tyranny and oppression. However, that is not the case for African Americans in the United States. They were not freed truly until June 19th, 1865. So many folks in the Black community do celebrate Juneteenth instead of the 4th of July. And some states, thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement, have begun to recognize Juneteenth as being a state holiday in recognition of freedom in the United States. Remember that although African Americans were freed at that time from slavery, they also were still not able to vote. They were free in that they were not enslaved any longer, but they were still experiencing trauma and oppression at the hands of white people in America, just as the Native Americans and Alaskan Natives were still experiencing persecution for their cultural and religious beliefs up until 1978. Additionally, sharecropping, the convict lease system, and black codes were instituted in 1965 as an alternative form of oppression against black people in America, and this was replacing the previous form of slavery with yet another. When the convict lease system was ended in 1867, 2 years later, it gave rise to chain gangs instead. Then from 1896 to 1954, the South was segregated with the concept of separate but equal rights. From the 1970s on, this type of oppression has continued in the form of mass incarceration, militarization of criminal police systems, police brutality, the war on drugs, and the for-profit prison system to replace the millions of enslaved African Americans. And we can still see this today as prisons incarcerate black people at more than 5 times the rate of white people within the United States, and they profit off of their unpaid and underpaid labor. The 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865 and was supposed to really do away with slavery. But they put in a clause. So it says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So slavery is still legal in the United States in the form of prisons. And we know that people of color, in particular black people, are imprisoned at a disproportionate rate compared to white people in the U.S., and their sentences tend to be longer as well. Many folks have argued that the 13th Amendment therefore makes an exception for slavery. And no court has really dealt with a formal distinction between the terms involuntary servitude and slavery. Many courts have used those terms interchangeably. And in 1871, a Virginia Supreme Court ruled that a convicted person was a slave of the state. Between 1866 and 1912, over 3,500 prisoners died in Texas with the convict leasing program. It was banned in 1912 because the death toll was so high. That is 2 years before World War I. That is 10 years before the setting of The Great Gatsby. That's 9 years after the Wright brothers made their first flight. As a nation, the United States had electricity and motorized movie cameras before we had gone ahead and stopped this convict leasing system. We also opened Fenway Park that year, and they had a game between the Red Sox and the Yankees. The Titanic sank that year. It was 108 years ago. However, not much has really changed since then. They just call it something else now. Now we have institutionalized and still prison-sanctioned slavery. They just are not called convict leases anymore. And my point of putting this into a historical context of the other things that happened around that same time are that we still talk about the sinking of the Titanic. We still study things like that and the first flight, but we don't tend to talk about it in relation to African American history. African American history is American history. And you also need to consider the fact that there are still people alive today whose parents may have lived through that. So going back to our epigenetics and how this can impact individuals, that is at the F1 level. That is a parent to the first child level. We're not even talking about F2, like the grandchildren, but it very well may also still be impacting them, and it may be impacting children, and children grow into adults for years to come. That's over 400 years of trauma that has been visited upon generation to generation, just under the guise of different names. And if you already have the epigenetic markers for your mother's trauma or your father's trauma, and then you receive your own trauma, and your partner may also receive their own trauma and have their own epigenetic markers from their parents and their grandparents. And then you have children. And so you just have what is potentially a cumulative pileup of these epigenetic markers that we've seen can impact not just our mental health or our emotional wellness, but also our reactions to the world around us, as well as our physical health. So it's not even just the symptoms of stress that we have shown that can epigenetically be changed to reduce our ability to respond to stress as human beings. We are not able to respond to it properly because the glucocorticoid receptors are not available due to that stress response prompted by stressors in the environment and affected by that epigenetic change being made. Additionally, this can lead to social, emotional, physical, and economic barriers to well-being. It is truly holistic in nature. And the theoretical framework of PTSS includes psychological symptoms of stress, self-doubt, depression, aggression, psychological and interpersonal relation dynamics with family members. When compared with the Native American and Alaskan Native groups that we discussed in the past segment, you can see the overarching point that this generational trauma can come out in very similar ways in different groups of people, despite their unique histories or interactions that cause the trauma, despite the types of trauma or their cultures or their lifestyles. Trauma can have a deleterious effect upon your epigenetics, and it can result in folks living with survivor syndrome or survivor's guilt. And those symptoms are very similar to those experienced by folks who have undergone multi-generational trauma, such as African Americans whose ancestors lived through chattel slavery and then through the Jim Crow era and through the convict leasing system and through the mass incarcerations of Black people that we continue to see today. Black identifying people of color in the U.S. have higher rates of diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease than other groups, and Black children have a 500% higher death rate from asthma when compared with white children, according to a study from 2016 by Harvard's School of Public Health. Additionally, some cities like Baltimore have as much as a 20-year discrepancy between the life expectancy of low-income Black individuals and higher-income white individuals. Racism is socioeconomic in nature. It is also related to inequality in terms of access to high-quality education, employment, housing, fresh foods or nutritious foods, outdoor spaces. Geography is important, and we still see many towns and cities that are split along racial lines. Segregation is illegal now, but that does not mean that it necessarily magically went away. These health inequities are important, and they show us that racism is a health and wellness issue. Health is built upon where we live and learn and work and play. And if you don't have clean water, how are you supposed to get those 8-ounce glasses per day? Especially since in our society we have commodified even water. This is especially evident right now with COVID-19, in which the health disparity of African American deaths are nearly 2 times greater than what would be expected based on their share of the population, according to NPR. In 4 states, that rate is 3 or more times greater. White deaths from COVID-19 are lower than their share of the population in 37 states and the District of Columbia. Intersectionality is holistic in nature, just like health and wellness. And to be clear, as a biological anthropologist, I can tell you that there is no such thing as biological race. There is not a single gene in the body that determines what you are going to look like. Race is a social construct. I would be remiss to not point that out as we are discussing epigenetics. Much like clinal variation in skin tone, which is associated with the distance from the equator by latitude, epigenetics are a result of environmental interactions, making changes to the expression of your genes. The genes themselves are not different. In fact, if you look at actual genetic variation in humans, you'll see that it roughly clusters along geographical regions. But this is also a continuous and gradual variation that we refer to as clinal variation. It's not discrete. It's not racial. There are no races, only clines, according to anthropologist Frank Livingston. And that is an excellent summation of what we as anthropologists have realized for years. It also reminds me of the Allen and Bergman rules that we have discussed in the past, which tell us combined that folks who live farther away from the equator and closer to the poles will tend to have shorter, stouter bodies because it's associated with the retention of heat that's necessary in those environments and that would have been adaptive in those environments, and that folks who live closer to the equator tend to be taller and thinner because they need to be able to release heat in order to be advantageous in that environment. Allen and Bergman's rules also show us clinal variation in height and robusticity, in addition to the type that we tend to see regarding skin tone and so on. And the variation between these different regions is very small, and it blurs those lines between populations. So there is no such thing as race because you can't put them into discrete groups. Racism doesn't make biological sense, but it can have biological outcomes via the world of epigenetics. These environmental traumas that are associated with oppression and historically subjugated groups can result in stressors flipping genes on and off, and then them being passed down to future generations. In this way, racism is very truly a health and wellness issue that can impact people's emotional wellness as well as their physical and mental health and their financial and social wellness. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Health and Wellness Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask you to please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Health and Wellness Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.